Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of April of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And of course the most important updates are coming from Bakhmut. We understand and we see that Bakhmut hasn't fallen yet, and we understand that this is the reason why Artyomovsk hasn't risen yet. We understand that these two events are going to take place at the same day, at the same moment, but for now the western part of Bakhmut is under Ukrainian control, and they're not going to give up and they're not going to step back. They want to hold this area as long as possible, and the Ukrainian intelligence and the Ukrainian sources are saying that there is a plan to hold the western part of Bakhmut until the counteroffensive, greatest counteroffensive operation of the Ukrainians. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes in Bakhmut, the Russians managed to establish and take control over a few blocks on the northern part of the western Bakhmut and a few blocks on the southern and the central part of Bakhmut as well. They are saying that as a result of those storming operations, the Ukraine lost another 270 soldiers, 14 armored vehicles, including one tank. Let's return back to the Western sources map. I have already updated this map showing approximately the progress and the situation in the western part of Bakhmut. As you can see, the bridgehead on the north and the south, and currently the Russians are trying to push along the water reserve along the river in direction of Khromovo. The Russians are trying to attack along the Levanchevskovo Street in direction of the military bases in the central part of Bakhmut, and the Russians are trying to move along the railroad ways to the south and along the railroad ways to the north, trying to encircle the Ukrainians who appeared in this small salient. The situation is very critical for the Ukrainians, and today we received another very important, the most important piece of news about Bakhmut. If you remember, when we were a few videos ago, when we were talking about the battle for the western part, we draw a lot of lines, we draw a lot of clouds and so on, and I told you that when we were talking about the situation, I had one question. I asked myself before we discussed the situation a few videos ago, how many civilians were left in the western part of Bakhmut? If you remember, I asked this question because this is very important. And I told you, if you remember, that if there are a lot of civilians left in the western part of Bakhmut, then this is completely different operation. The Russians will try to push the Ukrainians very slowly, step by step, trying to make and continue evacuation process, trying to save as much as possible lives of the civilians in this town and so on. And the second option was, if there are not many civilians left in the western part of Bakhmut, then the Russians will try to intensify the clashes and they will start using a very powerful weapon. My projection, my speculation a few videos ago was that the Russians were going to use flamethrower systems to break the entire resistance of the Ukrainians in this area. I almost got this situation. Currently today we start receiving updates that the Russians started using guided bombs in the western part of Bakhmut. This type of weapon is also very powerful, sometimes even more powerful than the flamethrower systems and so on. And today we received a lot of video and photo confirmations of explosions. A lot of people described, of officers and soldiers on the ground from the Ukrainian, from the Russian side, described the very big explosions in the western part of Bakhmut. Later we received updates that the Russians started using the guided bombs, and I understand that the Russians intensifying and they're trying and planning to take the control over the western part of Bakhmut as soon as possible. And there are like few options. First, there are not left civilians left, and the second one, the Russians want to establish control over the western part of Bakhmut before the Ukrainians launch their own counteroffensive operation. This morning, a few hours ago, I published a video about the possible Ukrainian attacks. One more time, the Ukrainians, according to the Zaluzhny and his planner, are going to attack in using 4 directions. The first one from Seversk in direction of Popasne, the second one along MO3 river, Ton Black, Artyomovsk, Bakhmut from the north, the third one from Konstantinovka in direction of Kurdyumovka and to unblock Artyomovsk from the south, and the final attack from Toretsk in direction of Debaltsevo in these areas. This is a very interesting plan, and the Ukrainians have already accumulated around 80,000 soldiers in this area. We understand that if the summer is coming, it's like the middle of the spring, and anyway sooner or later the weather is going to be fine in this area and the Ukrainians will be able to launch their counter-offensive operation. And I believe that this situation is going to happen very, very soon. And maybe this is the another reason why the Russians are trying to speed up, to hurry up by using the guided bombs, because of course if the Ukrainians are going to launch this counter-offensive operation, it will be much more safer for the Russians to take control over Bakhmut and to secure the flanks and then to stretch their Wagners along the front lines, because 80,000 soldiers, it is a lot, it is a very big army. We know that there is just Wagner's forces, there is airborne division in these Syrian forces, but I can't tell you for 100% sure that the Russians are able to repulse the Ukrainian attack. Also, I'm not saying that Ukrainians are able to defeat the Russians and so on. It will be a very bloody massacre if the Ukrainians launches anything, but anyway, this is going to happen. This is going to happen, and this is going to happen very soon. Furthermore, for example, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, for example, today he promised that the Ukrainians are going to enter Crimea this spring. So today is 17th of April, so there is like a month and a half left before spring will be changed by summer. So that means that Ukrainians during the next 4 weeks are going to enter Crimea, and there are a lot of kilometers to pass by before they're able to do this. Now let's go to the south and let's discuss South Donetsk area. The Russians reported that Ukrainians activated in this area. They are intensified their activity. They're almost every single day. They're sending more and more commandos and scouts trying to check and find the weak Russian positions. The Russians are saying that they are ready to meet the Ukrainians. We'll see, for example, today as a result of clashes and artillery duels. As you can see, there are also a lot of artillery duels, lots of explosions from the Ukrainian side took place in Orekhov and Zaporozhye area. The Ukrainians lost another 60 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. Also, the Ukrainians lost few ammo depots in this area, they lost few commandos. So, as you can see, the Ukrainians are not counting their resources. More and more Russian sources are saying that the Ukrainians don't have problem with artillery shells, with ammo, with anything. They are supplied and supported pretty well, and if they start, of course, it's not going to be something like easy for the Russians to defeat. It's going to be a very important and, let's say, the critical battle for both sides. And this battle, the late spring and beginning summer campaign will determine the situation in Ukraine for the rest of the year. Furthermore, it can even solve the entire special military operation. For example, very interesting updates are coming from the north. As you can see, Belgorod area is under very heavy fire. The Ukrainians, for the second or maybe for the third day in a row, are trying to attack this area using drones, using missiles, using every type of weapon they can that can be sent in the direction of Belgorod area. As a result of those attacks, the Russians few energy facilities were destroyed in the vicinity of Belgorod. The Ukrainians attacked and destroyed few buildings and some villages and so on. As you can see, there are a lot of icons. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that Ukrainians were trying to cross the border in the vicinity of this part of Ukraine, in the vicinity of Kharkiv, Sumy. That attempt was discovered by the Russians, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. But anyway, we see that Ukrainians are trying to test Russian air defense system in the vicinity of Belgorod. The distance between Kharkiv and Belgorod is around 70 kilometers, so it's nothing. And the Ukrainians have a lot of type of weapons, not just drones. They have missiles, they have rockets, they have a lot of artillery system that are able to reach the Russian position and Belgorod itself like easily from Kharkiv. The Ukrainians can hide this weapon in Kharkiv and to use this weapon at some certain time. But now they're testing their air defense system. I believe that all these attacks has some purpose, and the purpose is at some certain day they will launch a massive artillery and drone and missile attack somewhere in the vicinity of Belgorod. We'll see, but anyway, this is going to happen very soon. Now let's go to the Kupiansk and Liman front line. The Russians today published a lot of videos of usage of guided bombs in the vicinity of Svatovo as well. As I see, the Russians, let's say the visit card of the spring and late spring campaign phase of special military operation from the Russian side is the massive usage of the guided bombs. They're pretty cheap. They're very cheap in comparison with missiles. They're very effective, and now we see that the Russians have started using of air forces they had. They have a very powerful air forces that we still haven't seen the usage of. We haven't seen, and now they start using it, and we see the result. And I believe that the Russians will intensify and more the usage of the air forces and the usage of the guided bombs. The Russians are saying that as a result of bombings, artillery duels, commandos clashes, and so on along the Zherebets and Oskol River, the Ukrainians lost another 105 soldiers, 1 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. There are very heavy clashes inside of Kremenная forest. The Russians published more and more confirmation of their attack in the forest, of taking more and more position, and the Ukrainians are stepping back. And we remember that the main thing that the Russians are trying to achieve is to encircle and to pin down and to make blind the Ukrainian forces that are located on the hills in Bilogorovka. And I believe that they're pretty successful in that, and soon the situation in this area will be solved as well, also in Russian favor. More updates are coming from Avdiivka. The Russians continue attacking the Ukrainians inside of Avdiivka using guided bombs. They continue hunting for 110th Mechanized Brigade that located on the north of Avdiivka in the towns like Achertina, Arkhangelskaya, Novokalinovo, and so on. The Russians attacking these forces, all the forces in this area, using bombs, artillery systems, and so on. So we see that the Russians also intensifying their actions, and sometimes there is a feeling that maybe the Russians are also planned to do something. Very difficult to understand, very difficult to determine who is going to start the counter-offensive operation. From one side, we understand that maybe it's going to be the Ukrainians, but maybe they're doing everything to force the Russians to do this. Very difficult and very complicated situation, and I believe that this situation is going to be resolved even by the end of this week. I'm not saying that the entire story is going to be ended by the end of this week, but we are going to see some kind of maybe we are going to enter the next phase of the special military operation this week. Who knows? We'll see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.